Protecting the nation's secrets. How much classified information out there is really secret and why? Hello, this is John Hnatio reporting for the Objective News Network. Welcome to part 2 of Protecting the Nation's Secrets. How much classified information out there is really secret and why? Last time, we talked about a dual system of justice when it comes to the gigantic system of classification that is used by our government to, and I quote, protect the national security, close quote, of the United States. Well, as of the time of this broadcast, there are literally trillions, that's with a T, trillions of documents out there with top secret, secret, and confidential markings on them denoting different levels of so-called sensitivity. And the number keeps growing and growing and growing. Before I joined ONN, I was a government employee working for an agency called the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is part of the Department of Energy, or DOE. I worked there for many years, had the highest security clearances in the government, and learned a great deal about both the good and bad sides of classification. I learned that in some cases, secrecy actually becomes an obstacle to success. Based on my experience, there are two types of classified documents. Documents that are legitimately marked by conscientious people trying to do their jobs, and those that have classified markings applied to them for no reason, or worse, to hide something. In part 1, we promised to share a real and first-hand example of how classification authority in the wrong hands can be abused. In this case, a classic example of using classification markings to hide the truth from the American public. It was the early 1980s. I was much younger then. I served on a special team of nuclear assessment experts comprised of selected members from the U.S. military, the FBI, CIA, the Department of Defense, and other specialists who would go out and test the security of the nation's nuclear weapons arsenal. In the 1980s, there was an upsurge in international terrorism, and people were very worried that terrorists might try to get a hold of a nuclear weapon. Well, it was pretty startling what we found. Here's a short CNN news piece from way back when talking about it.
In Aiken, South Carolina, security guards trained to protect the highly sensitive Savannah River nuclear weapons plant from terrorist attack. Critics say this counter-terrorist training is a long overdue move towards safeguarding U.S. atomic weapons plants from sabotage, theft, and even the possibility of a nuclear explosion. For years, from within the Energy Department, security specialist John Hnatio has been waging his own battle to protect nuclear weapons plants against what he describes as his own department's complacent refusal to face up to the threat of nuclear terrorism.
It was sort of an attitude of, it's never happened before, and it can't happen here type of approach to the way business was done.
In 1979 and 80, Hnatio received awards and commendations for identifying gaps in security at nuclear weapons plants in Savannah River, Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. But when Hnatio continued to find fault, he was shifted to a desk job where he was no longer permitted to go out to the plants and look for problems.
They call this being put on the back burner, and I think I was put on the back burner.
Desk-bound, Hnatio gained a reputation among members of Congress for telling tough truths his bosses preferred not to mention. Congressman Albert Gore is a member of the House Energy Committee.
The information that we have gotten from John Hnatio has been right on target. And in fact, he's one of the only people in that whole part of the Energy Department who's been willing to give us the straight facts instead of just giving us a doctored up version that looks like they're doing their job.
Committee documents cite cases where Hnatio has been embarrassingly right. In 1981, Hnatio warned his bosses not to send a report to President Reagan that downplayed vulnerabilities at atomic weapons plants. A few months later, the General Accounting Office criticized that report as misleading. In 1982, Hnatio warned his superior not to sign off on a report describing Savannah River safeguards as effective. Within a year, Savannah River had flunked a series of security tests.
I felt it was important to tell the truth, and that's what guided me.
This past summer, Hnatio's bosses warned him that he was in danger of losing his security clearance.
I was shocked, really. I was scared. Without a security clearance in my area of work, you can lose your job.
The charge? Hnatio was accused of mishandling a classified document during a briefing with Republican congressional staffer Jim Christie.
Well, I was appalled, quite frankly, because at all times John Hnatio had acted professionally and conscientiously.
As things turn out, the Department of Energy is required to certify that they are protecting nuclear weapons and the materials needed to build them from falling into the hands of terrorists every year. The notification letter was written, marked secret, and passed along the chain of command for my concurrence. Well, I took one look at that document and shook my head. Instead of telling the president, in this case President Reagan, that the security of the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile was a disaster waiting to happen, the bureaucrats I worked for, who were responsible for the mess in the first place, chose to lie to the president, and by so doing placed the lives of potentially millions of Americans at risk. I refused to concur on the false report. My bosses simply bypassed me as they sent their original letter up through the president's national security advisor and on to the White House. Somehow, the fearsome Dingle Energy and Commerce Committee got word of the security problems plaguing the U.S. nuclear weapons program. My bosses, under congressional pressure, were forced to send me up to Capitol Hill to brief congressional staff, which I did. I confirmed that the Department of Energy was having severe problems in adequately protecting the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile. This is when all hullabaloo broke out. The story quickly hit the national news, and Congress held a series of hearings. The entire DOE bureaucracy hunkered down, and every bit of information about their own malfeasance suddenly became top secret to stop it from embarrassing the administration.
Christie says he would have told Energy Department officials that Hnatio was innocent, but he wasn't asked. He says Hnatio didn't show him the classified document at the briefing because Hnatio hadn't written it yet. In that document, which was submitted for proper security clearance, Hnatio summarized the extremely critical remarks he'd made about his bosses. He received his reprimand 6 weeks later, just hours before he was scheduled to tell another congressional aide about security foul-ups at nuclear weapons plants.
It certainly seems like more than a coincidence for him to be called in and intimidated the very day that he was scheduled to go brief a second committee.
No one responsible for reprimanding John Hnatio would speak to CNN. A panel of Hnatio's bosses were called before a House Energy Oversight Subcommittee last month, but they were unable to justify the charge against Hnatio or to explain why they broke their own rules when they investigated that charge. Congressman John Dingell became irate.
Well, what do you do when you find out whether proper security procedures are followed?
At that
is
stage,
that followed by an investigation,
or
is that followed by a maypole dance? Now, which occurs?
It would be followed, if appropriate, it would be followed by an investigation, which then gets into the technical details and step-by-step legalistic kinds of things you're talking about.
And
we never got that far.
Well, it got far enough that Mr. Hnatio got a reprimand.
It was a real-world example of how the government bureaucracy can use classification to hide the truth and avoid accountability for their own malfeasance. Of course, keeping things secret didn't do a thing to fix the deep-seated nuclear safety and security problems at the Department of Energy, and only made things worse. But the dangers of classification to avoid embarrassment and accountability in the government can go well beyond just stamping a bunch of documents classified and then clamming up about the truth. In my case, my bosses intentionally tried to turn the tables on me by making false claims that I somehow mishandled classified information by telling a senior congressional staff member the truth about the critical security failures that were leaving nuclear weapons vulnerable to theft by terrorists. Of course, the congressional staff member had a high-level security clearance, and no sensitive information was ever released outside of proper channels. But that didn't matter to my bosses. My bosses even used something called original classification authority to make everything about me classified, including my personnel records, like my own performance appraisals. I was ordered to forget about and never speak again about security problems by the Department of Energy's own director of the Office of Classification. But this did not stop my bosses from retaliating. Amidst all of this, I was subjected to investigations. I was no longer able to do my job of assessing nuclear weapons plants. My security clearance was threatened, and my career summarily destroyed right before my eyes. Of course, there is absolutely nothing new here. The effectiveness of any classification system depends on the virtuosity of our leaders. Like any system, it can be used for good or ill. It depends on the moral backbone and the virtuosity of those who are in charge. Remember things like the Pentagon Papers scandal that revealed the U.S. was secretly enlarging the scope of the Vietnam War, none of which was reported in the mainstream media? Classification was used to keep American citizens in the dark about what their own government was actually doing in Vietnam. Now, let's take a minute and turn to authentication to ask the question, cases where the government uses classification to avoid accountability. Here we are immediately taken to the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, site, where they talk about a few cases of how the U.S. government intentionally uses classification to cover up not only their misdeeds, but also their own liability as they retaliate against individuals they often label as whistleblowers, whether they're whistleblowers or not. That brings us to the conclusion of part 2 of our story, Protecting the Nation's Secrets. How much classified information out there is really secret, and why? Please join us the next time when we look at a couple of real-world examples of government employees who have been labeled as whistleblowers and retaliated against for committing truth about problems in their own agencies at places like the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Department of Defense, and many other agencies. It is what it is for January 16, 2023. This is John Hnatio reporting for the Objective News Network. Thank you for watching, and please tell your family, friends, and colleagues about ONN. At ONN, we are here to tell you the stories and provide the depth of reporting you cannot find anywhere else.
I think that for quite some time, these people were irritated that John Hnatio was consistently pointing out their shortcomings and was consistently being proven right. So they pretended that there was some kind of breach of national security. This was just an excuse.
The Energy Department's own Inspector General concluded that Hnatio had been treated unfairly. The reprimand was removed from Hnatio's file and destroyed. Hnatio even received a written apology.
That isn't the end of it. CNN has learned that Congressman John Dingell plans to ask the Justice Department to investigate the harassment of John Hnatio. It's a federal crime punishable by 5 years in prison to intimidate anyone who gives information to Congress.
Meanwhile, John Hnatio says he's learned a lesson.
If you're going to tell the truth against people who don't want to deal with it, the only advice I can say is be prepared. Be prepared for anything.
Sheila Hershow, CNN, on special assignment.